This microphone is here for the overhead. That goes to this one. Yeah. So, just a quick explanation on what we did with the questions. We compiled them, and obviously there was some repetition. So, this morning Steve Shalom and I kind of went through them, and we pulled out the repetition and we organized them in some kind of flow that made sense. And slightly edited some just to give some segue to others and whatnot. And we try to include just about everything. We might not get to everything, of course, but we've got the 2 rounds, the before and after lunch sessions, so we'll just see what happens and hope to best capture the questions that you have for Noam. Let me turn this on.
Does this work?
Yeah, I just have to turn it on. Should get some audio.
Is this working?
Yeah.
You can hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, first thing is everything that Mike said was a lie. I cleared the floor.
So, to begin with, can you hear me okay? Is this
Yes.
fine? Okay. To begin with, what is the left? What kind of language can we use to describe our movement and positions that actually mean something to us and others?
The left is the movement that's in favor of all decent things. Freedom, justice.
I've got, he's got.
Can't hear?
Well, you know, it's always the case now.
I can turn you up a little bit too.
Why don't I hold it?
Okay, if you want. Here we go. Okay.
Sorry, I kind of been talking just back from a couple of long trips and I totally lost my voice. So what's the left? We, of course, have to define it for ourselves, but traditionally it's the movement that's been in favor of more freedom, more justice, more equality, more participation, more control of our own lives, peace, in fact, all decent things. That's the left. How can you present it to people honestly? Just take issues, there's no point formulating abstractions. Anybody can say those words. Hitler can say them. What you have to show is you mean them by the particular way in which you apply them to the problems that people face and have. But the drive to pursue those objectives, I think that's what's always animated the left. Nothing very profound about it.
So switching to more some current events, the change that many voters hoped for would come in this country when Barack Obama was elected has yet to happen. What went wrong?
What went wrong was the hope. There was never any reason for it. And you can't blame him. If you read his website or you listened to you found what limited content there was and what he was saying, he presented himself as a normal centrist Democrat, not very different from, in international affairs, not very different from Bush's second term, very hawkish. There was just nothing there. I mean, I wrote about him before the election, before the primaries even, just using his website. And it was perfectly transparent. If people wanted to be deluded, they had the choice, of course. But, I don't usually agree with Sarah Palin, but when she asks what's happened to that hopey-changey business, she's exactly right. Nothing happened, and there was no reason to expect anything to happen. He was a creature of the financial institutions. They preferred him to McCain. The core of his funding was financial institutions and law firms, which doesn't mean civil rights lawyers, it means lobbyists. And they expected to be paid back. That's the way American politics works. And they were paid back. with a huge bailout. They're richer and better off than before. And there's very little in it to be surprising. So the question is, what do you do? I mean, this happened before. There was, history doesn't repeat exactly, but analogy is close enough to pay some attention to. If you go back to 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected with similar illusions. A lot of glitz, a lot of glamour, Camelot this, and so on and so forth. And it did elicit a lot of enthusiasm among young people who thought, okay, the world's going to change after these stodgy, terrible Eisenhower years. Well, it didn't take long for Kennedy for the illusions to be shed by Kennedy's actions. And what was interesting was how people reacted. They didn't react by saying, okay, we give up, the illusions are gone. They reacted by deep engagement in activism. And that led to the activism of the 60s, which had plenty of outgrowths like this, for example, and many others. And I think the serious question now is how people who were misleadingly who were misled by the illusions created around the Obama presidency, how they'll react. Two choices: react by saying, "Well, no hope. Let's give up. We'll go to our private lives," or saying, "Okay, we were misled. Now we're going to really pursue the illusions that were shattered, but that were the right ones." And you can have another period of activism and significant change. But I think that's really in the hands of the people who believe who were caught up in the wave of enthusiasm, mistakenly, but you can make mistakes and you can look back and say, how do we go on from here?
Do you have any strategic advice on how
No.
the...
Or tactical advice.
on how the left can better organize the legitimate popular grievances the right so successfully preys upon?
Well, there are things that can be done. I mean, it depends who you are and where you are. Like, I'm not going to organize steel workers. I'm not a steel worker. But in our own communities, we can do a lot of things. And they range from it's across the board. You just take, say, health reform, where it's a very serious issue. Let's start with the deficit. We're supposed to be. The propaganda today is we've got this hideous deficit. We have to concentrate attention on getting rid of it. Everything else has to go. Well, first of all, it doesn't make a lot of sense economically. In a recession, you want to have a deficit. You want to have a stimulus. That's how you grow your way out of economic recession. 17 million unemployed, and you get back to economic growth and you overcome the deficit. But putting that aside, what's the deficit? Well, if you listen to NPR, the deficit is Social Security and Medicare. But that's only because the rich and privileged have been trying for years to destroy them. Social Security isn't in any kind of trouble. Medicare is in trouble, but because it's linked to the privatized health system, which is in serious trouble. Take a look at the deficit. About half of it is military spending, which is going up under Obama. In fact, it's reaching new heights, and it's and nobody's talking about cutting that. So when people talk about cutting the deficit, you know right away they're not serious. The other half is pretty much medical costs. Maybe not right now, but you project it'll be the growing medical costs in the completely dysfunctional healthcare system are going to overwhelm the federal budget, which is not bad for the Peterson Institute and NPR and the right wing and so on, because they're just as happy to have the benefit systems cut. The rich will still get what they want. We already have a health system that essentially is rationed by wealth, and if it gets even more so, you're not going to get any complaints from wealth and privilege. But here are easy issues that are easy to organize about. It's true, there's a deficit. How serious it is, you could argue about, but it's there. So let's, riding the wave of concern about the deficit, let's look at what it comes from. I mean, do we have to spend as much as the rest of the world combined on military force, technologically far more advanced, hundreds of military bases all over the world? I don't think anybody's calculated it, but if you simply looked at the costs of the pre-positioned weapons around the world and the navies that the U.S. has scattered around the world doing nothing, just getting ready in case they're ever needed to use those pre-positioned weapons for aggression wherever it may be anywhere in the world, just calculate those costs, it would be astronomical. Do we need that? Is that good for us? Is it good for the world? Is it good for us to be working on advanced drone techniques with using nanotechnology? This is on the DARPA drawing boards, where you can get miniaturized drones that can find their way into a person's living room to kill a particular person who's under surveillance, and then all the way up to massive ones that carry out huge crimes. Is that what we need? I mean, is that what's good for the country or for the world, and so on? Plenty to organize on about that, and none of that's being discussed in the public arena. Take all the talk about the deficit. Again, I happened to listen to NPR on the deficit a couple of weeks ago. They had their talk program. They had one talk program a week, and they had two experts, both of them deficit hawks. Their only suggestion for dealing with the deficit was to cut Social Security and medical benefits. That's from the so-called left. Not a word about the military budget, not a word about why the healthcare costs are going out of sight. The healthcare reform is opposed by probably 2/3 of the population. But if you take a look at the polls, a very large part of that, maybe the majority, is because it didn't go far enough. It gave everything away. Okay, you can appeal to the people who have that position and explain to others that they're supporting a healthcare system that is about twice the per capita costs of the rest of the world, of other industrial countries, and has about the worst outcomes. For example, you can bring to light something that the press hasn't covered, an Amnesty International report studying maternal death around the world, death in childbirth. The United States is way at the top of the list. I think it's 5 times as high as Greece or something like that. It's just kind of outlandish. These and other studies comparing comparative health costs found, for example, that in Cuba, which is a poor country under attack for 50 years by the world's greatest superpower, health outcomes are about the same as the U.S. Expenses are 5% of the U.S. expenses. And the reason is that it's focused on preventive care. Clinics all over the place, doctors, mostly women, who say for maternity, not only do they give prenatal care, but the doctor will go visit the mother and the baby in the home, make sure everything's okay, and that sort of thing. Now, that's kind of taken for granted. All right, so for 1/20th of the cost, they get about the same outcomes we do. I mean, these two issues, the two issues that are causing the huge deficit, not so huge, but the large deficit, military and health. Yeah, those should be easy things to organize about, and they lead in all kind of directions. Now, if you're somewhere else, like if you happen to be living in central Michigan, you can be organizing about quite different things. So, for example, takes the government now pretty much owns much of the auto industry, and it's following the path of state corporate system for the last 30 years, transferring industrial production abroad. It's not closing down industrial production, it's just continuing the process that actually began around here, center of the Industrial Revolution. Then you get cheaper labor, worse conditions in the South, so you move there. Then you go to the Southwest and you move there. Okay, in recent years you go overseas. You go to Mexico and China and Vietnam and so on. So the production is still there, and the profits are still here, and the banks like it, and the managers and owners like it. But it's destroying the society. I mean, when you close down an auto plant, you're destroying not only the workforce, but the community. Communities are usually built around the industrial plants. Do they have to be closed? Well, there's plenty of things that are needed here. In fact, I've mentioned this a couple of times, maybe you've heard me say it, that at the same time that Obama is closing down GM plants, he sent his Secretary of Transportation, Roy LaHood, to Europe to get contracts using federal stimulus money, taxpayer money, contracts with mainly Spanish, but also other industrial firms in Europe to build high-speed rail transport, which we badly need here, and which could be produced in those closed-down plants. I mean, yesterday I came back from talks in New York, and I took the train, the fancy train, the Acela, hyper expensive one. I happened to have been in Germany not long before and took a train. I mean, you can't begin to compare them. On the Acela, you can sort of read, if you don't mind being bumped around a lot, but trying to write is almost impossible. My wife and I took the train to New York the first time in around 1950. It then was 3 hours and 45 minutes, and now they've got it down to 3 hours, 3.5 hours if you pay a couple $100. If it was in Europe or Japan or practically in China, almost anywhere, it'd probably be an hour. It would be comfortable and so on. Well, all of that can be built. I mean, it's not just an accidental, something that happened by accident. That's careful state corporate planning to design a particular kind of society that's highly wasteful in fossil fuel, that scatters people, that breaks down cities and so on, goes back to the 1940s. And it's led to a situation that's pretty harmful for everybody, except the rich, very rich. And it even harms them. They have to take the Acela too. But I mean, you can go first class, but so you get which actually somebody got me a ticket for once, so I took it. It's exactly like Coach, except that it's a caricature of the late 19th century, the Pullman trains. So there's a black porter who wears a white jacket and is very polite and helps you on board. And then there's a black maid who comes and puts a tablecloth on your table and serves you something or other. Other than that, it's like it's like my Coach. But here's kind of an obvious. What's the obvious strategy in this case? Well, the obvious strategy is for working people to take over the factories and take them over, run them, manage them, produce the high-speed rail equipment or whatever else is needed and badly needed in society. It's not such a radical step. It's the kind of thing that's just below the surface in American history. And for example, you go back to the 1930s, the major New Deal reforms were instituted when the business classes really got frightened. And they got frightened by sit-down strikes. Sit-down strikes are just one thought away from taking over the factory and running it yourself and kicking out the bosses, and that was scary. So changes came. Pretty much like what's happening in China now. In China, with working conditions are utterly miserable, and wages have been declining relative to GDP for the last couple of years. There's now a wave of strikes, as you've been reading on the front pages, in the foreign-owned plants. Most of the high technology and advanced production in China is foreign-owned. China itself is mostly an assembly plant. But But the strikes and first of all, a lot of suicides in the plants, and then it led to strikes, and now the Taiwanese and Japanese owners are being compelled to improve working conditions and wages. And if it goes beyond that to take over the plants, then they really get scared, and you get large-scale measures like the New Deal measures. Well, all of that is possible strategy. In fact, even tactics. Not for me, like I'm not working at Detroit, but for people who are in any similar, it could be a Starbucks store. Anyone who's in that environment, there are plenty of things you can do. And for the rest of us, those people like me say, there's these large-scale issues, and there are even bigger ones than that. I mean, we are, after all, facing two crises which literally have to do with survival of the species. One of them is nuclear weapons. It's a problem that's getting worse. Another has to do with destruction of the environment, which is very serious, and it's going to get a lot worse. There's plenty to do about that. And there's plenty of organizing possibilities. So just keep to the front pages. It always gives you opportunities. Well, right now there's a lot of concern about BP and the Gulf. Well, there's a number of things to say about that. One thing is that bad as this catastrophe is, it's not so substantial by global standards. I mean, what goes on in the Niger Delta, Nigeria, is incomparably worse. It's been going on for decades. Oil companies just destroying the place. Huge oil spills. But there are black people who are getting killed. So, who cares? It doesn't even make the newspapers. In fact, what's going on in Ecuador, in Amazonia, is worse than this, with the oil spills that are destroying parts of the Amazon and the indigenous communities. I mean, now it's hit here to the wealthy people, so of course it makes the front pages. But that gives an opening for lots of discussions. And what's happening right here is in substantial part traceable to the collapse of the regulatory apparatus under the neoliberal fanaticism of the last generation, which is pretty much the same as what led to the financial crises. There weren't any financial crises from the 1930s until the 1970s because the regulatory system was in place and the financial system was more or less state regulated. But with the explosion of finance and the elimination of regulation, okay, you get repeated crises, getting worse and worse. We're now building up to the next one. And the same is true of the environmental crisis. Well, all of these things are, there's so many things that you can organize about that it's kind of almost pointless to mention them. You just stick a pin at random in almost anything in people's lives. And there's an issue there that requires work. It can be a simple issue. So a lot of organizing starts with things like, say, getting people in a poor neighborhood together to get the city council to put a traffic light on a street where kids have to go to school. And if people can achieve that, they can learn that you can achieve something. Then they go on to the next thing. And there are groups that do it, and do it pretty well. Right here in Boston, for example, there's, just to show you how atomized the society is, I didn't even know anything about it, though I've been living here most of my life. But there's a very good group in downtown Boston, Vita Urbana, which has been doing things exactly like this, very successfully, for I think about 35 years, in poor neighborhoods, mostly immigrant neighborhoods. They meet in a place called English High School, which is called that because nobody in sight speaks English, I think, anything but. But they're happy to go to a meeting, listen to the things they're doing. It's pretty impressive. And it does go from simple things like let's get a traffic light to empowerment to looking for bigger things like let's do something about the schools and drug problems and on and on. Those are things you can organize about. And that's the mission of the left. It's not hard to find.
considering the general exploitation of homophobia by the right, how can we as activists, leftists, or generally conscious citizens advocate for lesbian, gay, bi, and transsexual queer people in America and abroad?
Just the way it's been done for a couple of decades now, pretty successfully. There are some pretty striking changes in the last years. We should pay attention to them. So take, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I'll take a dramatic case. One of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing, who's famous for having developed a lot of the mathematical theories that led to modern computation and so on. He also happened to be one of the people who saved England during the Second World War. He was in the lead and among the mathematicians who cracked the German codes. So he's a major figure in England. He was murdered by Britain in the early 1950s. He was homosexual. They regarded it as a disease, and he was subjected to some curious kind of treatment which killed him. I mean, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. Okay, that's pretty significant. How did it happen? Well, we all know how, by education, by organizing, by activism. It has to be done in a way which doesn't frighten people and appeal to their, sort of elicit their worst emotions and reaction. So you don't want to kind of brazenly flaunt in front of people your attacks on their values. You have to make them, help them come to understand that their values include tolerance and acceptance. And it's hard work, no special strategy that I've ever heard of, just to keep at it, and it makes changes. It's very substantial changes all through a large part of the world, right in our own lifetimes.
What forms of resistance can help us stop the racism and anti-immigrant sentiment that seems to be growing?
Well, first of all, you have to understand it. I mean, the people who are, the anti-immigrant sentiment is extraordinary. Just take a look at the elections yesterday in Europe. In Holland, which has been a very tolerant society for hundreds of years. Back in the 17th century, people from France and England were fleeing to Holland because they had some sort of freedom there. In Holland, there was a very high vote for extreme right-wing, anti-immigrant racist, anti-Muslim racist, who's a real neo-Nazi. I mean, among his programs are what he calls, what does he call it? I think a raghead tax or something like that for women who wear veils. They have to pay a rag tax, things like that. A really vile, racist, anti-Muslim sentiment. And he's got a lot of support. In England, just yesterday, the new Conservative government passed a law, or introduced a law that requires that the spouse, an immigrant spouse, can be admitted to England only if he or she speaks English. It's kind of unbelievable in a civilized country. Aside from the idiocy, the place to learn English is in England, not in a second language school in Africa or someplace. But apart from the idiocy, the racism is extreme, and it's very strong here, and kind of understandable. People have the feeling that they, are taking everything away from us. I mean, we work hard. We're Christians. We're white. We've worked hard to achieve what we have, and now they are taking it all away from us. Who are they? Well, they are the illegal immigrants. Just like in, let's see, Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, the Jews and the Bolsheviks were taking it away from us. So we got to do something about it, and it didn't turn out very pretty. But the feelings are genuine, and the feelings have to be dealt with. and have to be dealt with by partly just explaining what the facts are. First of all, why are immigrants coming from Africa to Europe instead of going the other way around? Why are they coming from Mexico and Guatemala instead of people here going there? Actually, people here do go there, mainly rich people who buy land in Costa Rica to retire. But apart from that, why is the wave of immigration south to north? Well, people don't understand that, because the sources of that have also harmed them, apart from the fact that they've been involved in criminal acts, which they should also understand. So take, say, the immigration from Mexico and Central America to the United States. What's the source of it? Well, from Central America, the source is Reagan's terrorist wars. Tore the countries to shreds. In some places, like the Mayan areas in Guatemala, there was literal genocide in the 1980s. In fact, they're kind of unseen because undocumented aliens kind of keep quiet. They may clean your homes and cut your lawns and do the construction work and so on, but they try to keep them visible. But right around Boston, in northeast of Boston and all through Rhode Island, there's a pretty big Mayan community. People who just fled from the virtual genocide in the Guatemalan highlands that the U.S. was supporting in the 1980s. Well, something people should know. It's not just that these people are coming here because they're trying to steal from us. We destroyed their lives. In fact, we slaughtered them. Okay, the remnants are trying to get away from it. Latin America altogether has had a horrible history of repression and violence. Two sources. One is Western imperialism last century. It's mostly us. The other is their own elites, mostly Europeanized white elites, which are vicious and brutal and savage. And between those two kind of hammers, they've been crushed. And the countries are now very poor. If you look at how they're doing a little better now, but a large part of their improvement now is just coming from remittances. In fact, remittances to Latin America are at about the level of, they're more than foreign aid, and about the level of foreign direct investment. They survive on that basis. Well, it's again the result of histories of centuries of violence and oppression. Let's turn to Mexico. It's a pretty striking case. You may have, I just read the paper this morning coming down here that yesterday a 15-year-old boy was murdered by a U.S. Border Patrol agent in Mexico. Crossed over into Mexico and killed this 15-year-old kid. And it ended up with the Mexican Army and the U.S. Border Patrol, aiming rifles at each other. We're aware with but it's very brutal. Even apart, the people who are coming across, I happen to know somebody, just personally, I won't go into the details, that the woman who's just gave birth to a baby a couple of weeks ago. She, in the last year, she's Mayan, fleeing from the Mayan areas. She crossed the border 8 times in the last year. Most of the period when she was pregnant, never had any prenatal care or anything like that. And she was caught and sent back the 8th time. She finally made it, thanks to the work of very courageous solidarity workers in Arizona, mostly young people who leave bottles of water in the desert. And people kind of get through the 30 miles of desert that they have to go through, which is a murderous experience. If they survive it and aren't caught by the border police, the solidarity activists help them get out of the area and so on. So she made it on her 8th try. It's now okay, just had her baby. But why are, she happens to be Mayan, but a lot of them are Mexican. But why are the Mexicans coming? Well, there's something called NAFTA, which was established in 1994 by the liberals. It was rammed through over the opposition of the American public and the Mexicans and the Canadians. The media, there were alternative programs proposed by the labor movement, Congress's Research Bureau, and so on. The media wouldn't even report on this long story. But Clinton managed to ram through the executive version of NAFTA. And if you look at the background, it's pretty clear what it was about. I'll go into that in a minute if you're interested. But the point is that when NAFTA was established, it was understood that it's going to destroy Mexican agriculture and Mexican business. Mexican agriculture cannot compete with U.S. agribusiness, which is massively state subsidized, thanks in large part to Reagan. The free market talk was rhetoric, but meanwhile, the huge subsidies to agribusiness. And Mexican corn farmers and so on aren't going to be able to compete with it. So, of course, if they're forced to accept imports from highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, it's going to wipe out the agricultural system. Mexican businesses can't compete with U.S. multinationals, also massively government subsidized, quite apart from scale, which have to get national treatment in Mexico. They have to be treated like Mexican businesses under NAFTA. So, of course, it's going to devastate the Mexican economy, and people are going to flee. Well, where are they going to flee? Well, they're not going to flee to Guatemala, so they're going to flee to the United States. So what do you do about it? Well, Clinton understood exactly what to do about it. The border between Mexico and the United States had been a pretty open border. It was established, of course, by conquest, and pretty much the same people lived on both sides. So people would cross the border to, visit their cousins or go to a party or something like that. In 1994, the same year NAFTA was passed, Clinton initiated the militarization of the border, Operation Gatekeeper. Why? Well, anybody could see that the impact of NAFTA, which is going to be harmful to American workers too, as it was, is also going to lead to a flow of immigrants. So you got to stop them by force. And then you get yesterday when a border guard kills a kid in Mexico, or the young woman I was talking about who managed somehow to make it 8 times and have a baby here finally. Well, that's the immigrant issue. These are the bases of it. And in fact, the fact of the matter is that immigrants contribute to the American economy. When an immigrant comes in, it leads to economic growth. For one thing, they're treated horribly. They're all over the place. They're doing all the dirty work, a lot of the dirty work in the society, whether it's cleaning homes or cutting lawns or construction work or whatever, and doing it at horrible wages and working conditions. They can't complain about it because, for obvious reasons, they're undocumented, so they're easily exploitable. But they send back remittances, but they also spend money that leads to businesses developing, economic growth, and so on. So their net effect, just from a pure economic point of view, is beneficial to the economy and even to the people who's. It's not really that they're threatening jobs; they're taking jobs that American workers don't want to take. They don't want to work under those conditions, rightly. But this is a whole mass of issues that can be discussed to deal with the anti-immigrant hysteria, but it has to begin by recognizing that it does have legitimate roots. People feel threatened, seriously threatened. Their way of life is being taken away from them. It's just not being taken away from them by immigrants. It's being taken away from them by Goldman Sachs executives. And they got to understand that. That takes some work. That's what organizing's about. Taking the legitimate grievances that people have, recognizing their legitimacy. The same is true on homophobia. Recognize legitimacy and come to terms with it. Get people to help people try to understand what the sources and causes are, and what it reveals about themselves. Their own internal problems that they ought to face, but also what it reveals about the society in which they live and the propaganda to which they're being subjected. But, that's the work of leftist organizing. But the problem is serious. It's not the United States, it's worldwide. Europe, it happens to be Turks and Muslims and Africans. But in the United States, it's people coming from the wreckage we've created in Latin America. And all of those are things to be seriously confronted sympathetically, but without giving an inch on the real issues.
It's currently 12, so I'm thinking we'll just ask one more question, and then we can take the break for lunch and come back and continue afterwards.
Okay. Ask me later about the background to the Mexico thing. It's kind of interesting. It never appear in the press, anyway, of course.
So shifting focuses somewhat. Given that Great Britain was always able to rule some of its colonies with minimal presence on the ground in terms of colonial staff, what are the prospects for Iraqi sovereignty? Should we expect indirect rule in Iraq?
Well, it depends on two factors, primarily Iraqis and secondarily us. What happened in Iraq is extremely interesting. Maybe there's more time later I'd like to talk about it, but I think what happened in Iraq is that the United States was actually defeated. It was quite unusual. For example, in Vietnam, which was called a defeat, I think it was actually a victory when you look at the actual war aims. But Iraq, if you look at the war aims, it was defeat, a serious defeat. And the main factor in it was nonviolent resistance. The U.S. was able to kill insurgents. We're really good at killing people. Got a massive murder machine. But they could not deal with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demanding elections, which the U.S. tried in every way to block. But contrary to the headlines, the U.S. was desperately trying to prevent any form of democracy in Iraq. But they couldn't block it. Step by step, the U.S. had to back off. Finally, again, you really have to search to get the data, but they're important. It's important. I mean, as late as